We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Marcia Nelson. I'm a Senior Strategic Advisor at PwC, and I'm going to be hosting today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. The School of Public Policy, as you know, is Canada's leading policy school, known for our practical research. The school is currently undertaking research to explore the potential for an ambitious national project, the Canadian Northern Corridor. The Canadian Northern Corridor would be a network of multimodal rights-of-way across the middle and northern parts of Canada with an accompanying policy, regulatory, and governance structure. The corridor would provide space for the coordinated development of infrastructure such as road, rail, electricity transmission, pipelines, and communications infrastructure. The Canadian Northern Corridor Research Program is a flagship research program of the School of Public Policy here at the University of Calgary. The purpose of the program is to provide the information and analysis necessary to establish whether the project is feasible, desirable, and permissible to establish corridors in Canada. So thank you all for joining us for the third webinar in this series. Our final webinar will take place on March 16th. If you have to leave early today, recordings of the webinars are posted on the School of Public Policy's website, and you'll receive a link to this in the follow-up email after the webinar concludes. I want to remind everyone to type your questions into the Q&A box below, and I will pose them to our speaker today for the entire length of time that we have during the Q&A portion of our discussion. So for today's presentation, we have Professor Dwight Newman here to present on key constitutional issues relevant to the Canadian Northern Corridor. Dwight Newman is a professor of law and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Rights in Constitutional and International Law at the University of Saskatchewan. Dwight is widely published on areas including the duty to consult, Canadian constitutional law, Indigenous industry agreements, and international Indigenous rights. And I know Dwight has an excellent presentation for us today. So Dwight, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, good morning, and thanks for the chance to be part of this series. It was a delight to write a paper as part of the research program that's underway, and to have a chance to talk about it a bit today. So my paper was commissioned as one to look at some key constitutional dimensions of the Northern Corridor project, or potential project. In thinking about the Northern Corridor, there could be a number of different reasons for considering that proposal. They could include, obviously, things like development of different parts of the country. They could include also things like coordinated development that thus achieves the best outcomes while minimizing negative social and environmental impacts. And they can also include having a viable means of getting each individual development proposed approved. And in essence, one of the challenges that Canadian infrastructure development seems to have faced in recent years is a challenge of facing many different decision makers, and a challenge then of getting to an actual decision on projects in a timely way. And you can think of that in broad terms when I speak of different decision makers, but in some terms, or in some contexts, we have not just the federal government involved, but provincial governments involved or claiming a right to be involved, municipal governments involved or claiming a right to be involved, Indigenous governments obviously having a stake in matters as well, and in some contexts, rights that bear on the approval of projects. You could throw in the courts as a decision maker as well when there's conflict amongst some of the others. But in this mix of all these decision makers, it can be quite challenging to get a particular project over the finish line, let alone even to a final decision at times. There's a theoretical concept called the jurisdictional anti-commons that I referenced briefly in the paper that in some ways is about this problem of too many decision makers on projects. So it's a known problem that can arise with infrastructure projects or other kinds of projects. I don't focus on that economic concept in the paper, but I ask this question, is that where the Constitution leaves us? Does it leave us in a jurisdictional anti-commons where there are just too many decision makers and it becomes difficult to reach conclusions? Or are there ways the Constitution can facilitate the development of something like the Northern Corridor? Are there ways the Constitution may complicate aspects of that? And where do we end up with in terms of different avenues to explore in terms of how the Constitution bears upon the Northern Corridor? So in some ways, it's a high-level overview to set the stage for potential further research on more detailed questions. I'll flag some of those in what I say today, and you'll notice they're not all legal questions. They're questions about a variety of different subjects at times. Some others may be legal questions as well. So there's this vision of a potential Northern Corridor with a set of multimodal rights of way. What's the government structure to get there? What's this high-level overview? Before I turn to that, I want to set out a few limits on what I'm doing. And I go through these in some detail in the report, but I am engaged in a very high-level overview. I'm assuming that we're working with the current Constitution as opposed to there being any kind of constitutional amendment involved. And there would be ways of pursuing constitutional amendments that could facilitate something like the Northern Corridor. But constitutional amendment is not a simple process in Canada. And so I've left that off the table, but it in a sense flags something someone could take up if they thought that were a more viable route. I'm not talking about the peace order and good government power, which has been adjudicated upon recently by the Supreme Court of Canada in the carbon tax case, and has been in the news in a different context in the last week, in the context of the implicit use of the POG or peace order and good government emergency power in the context of the invocation of Canada's Emergencies Act. So there's been some action on this POG power in the last year. In the carbon tax case, there was an adjudication that if they met certain requirements, the requirements of the pertinent legal test, the enunciation of national standards on particular issues could end up being within exclusive federal jurisdiction, or at least federal jurisdiction under the POG power. There may be avenues to explore in terms of how that could bear upon something like the Northern Corridor, but I've not dealt with those in the paper. Those were excluded from the outset. I'm not considering certain kinds of charter claims, which I consider to face a challenging uphill road in some respects. Issues like a charter right to the environment that could bear upon something like this, as on any natural resource or infrastructure project. But the case law hasn't developed very much on that, even though some have argued for it. And so again, I've set that aside. And this paper, although one could do it in a different way that would be geographically situated, is discussing the issues in a high-level way that's not geographically situated. At the same time, I want to say there are major geographic differences that are very pertinent to how some of the different factors would interact. And especially the different situation in respect of Indigenous rights in different parts of the country is very pertinent when we talk about the dimension on Indigenous governments and Indigenous rights. In some parts of the country, there are historic treaties negotiated in the period basically up to 1921. In some parts of the country, there are modern treaties negotiated basically since the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement in the from the 1970s onwards. We could date this period, and in between there was a gap with not really treaty negotiation between the 1920s and the 1970s. And in some ways, the modern treaty era really gets going with the Nisga'a Agreement, as in some ways later on, that became a bit of a model for some of the others. So it's been larger since the 1990s. These agreements tend to be much more detailed and to provide explicit recognition of self-government powers for First Nations that are part of a modern treaty, and a lot of other things in them as well. But I guess those are a very different legal regime than a historic treaty is, which tends to be much less detailed, expressed at a more principled level, and as I say, to have dated to this period prior to 1921, and thus to reflect certain different approaches to negotiation present at that time. And there are, of course, parts of Canada that don't have treaties in place, either historic treaties or modern treaties, areas with unceded lands, and where there are outstanding Aboriginal title claims, outstanding Indigenous rights claims of various sorts. Those three different contexts have some pretty different significance for what consequences Indigenous rights have and what roles Indigenous governments have in respect of a northern corridor that might cross all three kinds of different types of legal regimes in respect of Indigenous territory. So I'll flag that as something that matters geographically depending upon the exact route, but that is outside the scope of what I'm principally doing in the paper in terms of providing a high-level overview of constitutional issues. In providing that overview of constitutional issues, I focus first on the intersection of federal and provincial governments. And that's not because Indigenous governments are any less important, particularly in the way that things are developing in Canada today. It's more about achieving a certain analytical clarity. And so I'll talk first about the federal provincial issues and then add a further layer with Indigenous rights issues and the rights of Indigenous governments and the powers of Indigenous governments as a very important part of the conversation, although one that needs a lot of ongoing attention and ongoing work. In respect of the federal-provincial interaction, the first thing that I want to say is that the way in which Canada's Constitution has been interpreted in particular does offer a key means of facilitating cooperation that could overcome or have the potential to overcome differences as between federal and provincial governments, or at least the division of jurisdiction, I should say. The challenge is just because the Constitution can facilitate an agreement doesn't necessarily mean one's possible or will be achieved. And I'll talk of some examples in just 1 second here. But this is the area of constitutional law or federalism law known as intergovernmental cooperation and interdelegation. And this has been a challenging area over the years. There's a lot of earlier case law on this, and some could be nervous that the delegation of powers as between the federal government and the provincial governments could be an illicit constitutional amendment and thus something not to be permitted. And what the Supreme Court of Canada has developed things towards is a recognition that certain kinds of permanent transfer of jurisdiction would be illicit and would be an inappropriate constitutional amendment. But it is very possible for a government of one level to utilize the regulatory mechanism of the other level of government, and indeed possible to negotiate certain kinds of cooperation within intergovernmental agreements. The Supreme Court of Canada has pronounced most recently on this in a substantial way in the Pan-Canadian Securities Reference, a decision of 2018, in which it upheld a system being developed cooperatively in respect of securities regulation after the prior decision that the federal government couldn't simply regulate securities regulation on its own, which maintained the long-standing view, but nonetheless surprised many when they thought that federal securities regulation had many efficiencies. Well, efficiency isn't the only thing that matters in a system of federalism, and as a result, the Supreme Court of Canada had struck down the national securities regulation system in a prior decision. A more cooperative route was upheld, one that would involve this kind of interdelegation and negotiation of delegations as between the federal and provincial governments in some respects. That said, the fact that something is constitutionally permitted doesn't mean that it necessarily will work. And in fact, that cooperative system around securities regulation has subsequently fallen apart out of differences in viewpoint between those that were participating in it and involved in it. And so that's a challenge. And I guess something to say is that constitutional law doesn't resolve all disagreements. It just sets the stage for a possible way to get to an agreement that can be legally upheld. I think here what I would flag is that the way in which the Constitution can facilitate these kinds of agreements implies that we need to look at how those kinds of agreements involving interdelegation have been successfully achieved in the past. And one could look in the most recent experience to the securities regulation context, although that's an example of something falling apart. So maybe one doesn't want to look at that too much. Around an infrastructure development of significance, though, it might well be valuable to draw upon historians, and there is material there on the Trans-Canada Highway development, for example, going a few decades back, but that employed different kinds of interdelegation and cooperation between the federal and provincial governments. That kind of history might have something to say. Obviously, there have been changes in Canada since then, but there may nonetheless be lessons to be derived from past historical achievements, even if they are some ways back in time. So the Constitution facilitates things through the possibility of intergovernmental cooperation and interdelegation. How else might it facilitate things and or complicate things? I'll say if there weren't cooperation achievable, there might be theoretical possibilities of federal unilateralism. And I actually don't end up suggesting that that's the ideal route to take, so much as that sets the stage for federal leadership. But I do want to outline just briefly the way in which the Constitution sets up possibilities for federal unilateralism around a major infrastructure project. There are three key doctrines in federalism in respect of federal and provincial governments and the division of powers between them. One of those is validity and the scope of powers assigned to each level of government. A second is that of federal paramountcy, which I'll come back to in a moment. And a third is a doctrine called interjurisdictional immunity, which again, I'll come back to in a moment. The federal and provincial powers, in terms of the validity of their legislation and regulation, are mainly found in sections 91 and 92 of the Constitution Act 1867. Some are found in other sections continuing on through section 95. One of the key federal powers that matters to something like the Northern Corridor proposal is the federal power over interprovincial transportation and communications, and particularly interprovincial transportation, although perhaps communication too, depending on other things that might be laid upon these multimodal rights of way. That federal power is significant. It doesn't necessarily mean, if you look just at validity issues, that the federal government would control everything about an interprovincial transportation route. And we've seen those challenges emerge from provinces and even from municipalities in the pipelines context, obviously a heated context in recent years, and quite possibly one of the motivations behind trying to find a different approach to things that gets a multimodal route developed and then has a governance mechanism with practical ways of addressing particular projects within that context. Well, the provincial governments have jurisdiction over many local matters, over property and civil rights, own a lot of crown land that might be at play. So the provinces do have a jurisdictional stake in things. That's where we turn in many ways to the other two doctrines, one of which is that of federal paramountcy. If there's a conflict between federal legislation and provincial legislation defined in certain legal ways, the federal government's legislation takes priority, has paramountcy in support of it. A federal government motivated to do so could craft its legislation such that it would take priority over provincial legislation as long as it operates squarely within an area of federal jurisdiction. Beyond that, the doctrine of interjurisdictional immunity protects a certain core of each power of federal and provincial governments. Traditionally, it's been applied mainly to federal powers, but that in principle has changed in recent years. The federal government could assert a protection of the core of its power over interprovincial transportation and communications. It has done so in respect of a number of issues on pipelines, for example. There's also case law around cell phone towers and different things. And the courts, at least to this point, have fairly strongly upheld interjurisdictional immunity, offering protection to federal abilities to make key decisions around interprovincial transportation and communications. That came under a lot of challenges in the pipelines cases. It's come under academic criticism as well, people who've argued that this should change. One reason not to rest too much on federal unilateralism is things could change over the years. As there's a recognition of federal and provincial roles in environmental matters, there could end up being, at some point, developments around this. There were strong provincial assertions by provinces like Quebec and British Columbia of their stake in how pipelines would be developed, for example. And so there would be the possibility of changes in the case law over time. And in thinking of something like the Northern Corridor, one needs to be thinking not just of what the law is today, but what it might be in the decades down the road. And so there's prudence that calls for not resting too much on law that could change, even while that law seems relatively secure. The other way in which the federal government could assert a somewhat unilateral role, though, is that it has a power called the declaratory power in section 92 sub 10 sub C, where it can take up jurisdiction in respect of even a project within one province that's in the national interest. And there's been some discussion over whether they can use this in a project that crosses provinces. In theory, they don't need to, but in some of the pipelines disputes, I looked into this, and there are actually a lot of instances in the past where they have, and there might again be things to be learned from history, but there are tensions around any assertion of federal unilateralism, and it may be that what all of this says more so is that there's a significant federal leadership role provided for constitutionally, and that also achieves a practical aim in providing a lead government in a sense. So, but one that would work cooperatively, ideally, with the provinces. The other area, though, that we need to overlay over everything is Indigenous rights and the role of Indigenous governments, a rapidly developing area of law. I don't spend a lot of time on this in the paper, in part because there have been other papers commissioned within the School of Public Policy's project that have engaged with this. A really excellent paper on the duty to consult, and it's implications for the project that was part of the series. The duty to consult is very significant and speaks to the need to proactively consult with Indigenous communities in advance of a government decision that has the potential to have an adverse impact on their rights, even where there's not agreement around the final scope of those rights in intergovernmental agreement or in the courts. That obviously bears on a lot of contexts within a potential northern corridor. But we're actually seeing a lot of legal action in recent years beyond the duty to consult context, which is a change. The duty to consult had become immensely prominent in recent years. We're seeing a lot of case law starting to emerge again around Aboriginal title, around treaty rights, around Aboriginal rights beyond Aboriginal title, but Section 35 Aboriginal rights. And I'll just say that's an area to flag for lots of attention in terms of how those various rights could bear upon the Northern Corridor. In addition to this, we of course have a new legislative regime, both at the federal level and in British Columbia, and we might see it over time in other provinces, that's moving towards a form of implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's not a constitutional consideration per se, but it may come to affect constitutional case law, and it certainly represents a significant legislative commitment currently in both federal legislation and British Columbia legislation that also needs to be flagged as having significant implications. In terms of the governments that are going to be involved in the Northern Corridor, those would be a large set of governments. And there's a challenging task in some ways in bringing everyone together. That's where we need really good federal leadership, very good collaborative federal leadership if the project is going to succeed. The Constitution does set out some ways in which it facilitates aspects of this, some of which call for more attention to both law and other disciplines. And it also, at the same time, in the service of the various schools that it protects, offers elements that introduce some complications to a project like the Northern Corridor. The ways in which it facilitates things might overcome the complications, but it requires some pretty significant work, both in terms of the groundwork that's to be laid through projects like that of the School of Public Policy, and also significant work in terms of the federal leadership role that would be taken up. And so I've spoken long enough. I certainly think there are interesting things to flag here, but there may be other things you want to talk about or things you want to go in deeper on, and I'm very happy to engage in that discussion. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dwight, for a great presentation and also for the preparation of an excellent paper. I had the chance to read it, and so, you know, I just would really highly recommend it to folks on the call. And I'll speak more about when the paper is going to be available at the end of our discussion. But Dwight, let me start with a question about the notions of constitutional authority. So there may be some people who would view that the question of constitutional authority should be fixed, right? Either something is in the Constitution or it isn't. Yet you emphasize the need to be attentive to the way that constitutional norms might yet shift. I think you encourage everyone to look at the complex and evolving constitutional landscape. And I love this. I think you use the words that proponents of the CNC need to watch this space carefully, right? Because things are going to change. So I wondered if you could just expand on this notion a little bit around the fluidity versus the fixed nature concept of the constitutional authority.
Okay, and that's a great question. It's frankly a tension that always exists in any constitution in some respects. And I'm someone who in many ways sees a lot of value in recognizing the fixed elements of the Constitution. Those reflect what was actually negotiated in the constitutional negotiations. But at the same time, there are ways in which the Constitution comes to be deployed differently over time that unsettle some of the things that that may have seemed like balances there. And if you start changing one part of what's going on under the Constitution, often for coherence of what's going on, as well as the fit with what is in the Constitution, other things end up changing. Interpretations can end up shifting to some degree over time. And they do that in light of some of the ways in which governments take up those powers and achieve certain fixed positions over time. Some of the areas in which governments have jurisdiction have an element of which government moved into an area first. And that's not in the Constitution in the text, but it is very much now part of our constitutional structure that things work that way. And so just the way that different parties have used the Constitution over time has now accumulated a history to it that comes into play as well. And then there are new challenges that that sometimes lead decision makers to respond in ways that need to be in keeping with the constitutional story, but that may develop new chapters to it in some respects. And so there's a lot we could get into on this, lots of interesting legal philosophy questions. In writing the paper, I've tried to take a practical approach that recognizes some of those developments over time and the potential for future developments, as well as overlays that aren't necessarily constitutional, but that bear on all of this, something like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And all of this means that the law is not going to be identical a few decades from now compared to right now. And at a practical level, everyone needs to be taking account of that, regardless of the bigger legal philosophy debate that we could have as well.
Great, great. Well, another statement you made that I thought was just bang on was you said the challenge for the CNC is to address too many decision makers in an interjurisdictional project, right? Too many decision makers. So many decision makers, each with their own areas of authority. It just took me back very much to the experience of the provincial government in advocating for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I was a deputy minister in government at that time. And, you know, obviously there were lots of debates with the province of BC, and I think it was this city of Burnaby. And, you know, at that time, the province was advocating strongly with the federal government that they should use the principle of federal paramountcy in the area of interjurisdictional transportation and interjurisdictional infrastructure to basically force, you know, this project to move through. And what we saw at that time was, while the federal government had an acknowledgement of this authority that they had, there was real reluctance to exert that authority. And what they ultimately chose to do was to pursue, you know, ownership of the project, you know, assume a commercial interest in order to advance the project. So my question here is for you, are there lessons for the CNC here rooted in a federal reluctance to exert its constitutional authority, that in fact they may prefer to use other avenues I think to establish leadership? Are there lessons here for us?
Oh, indeed there are. And I mean, a situation like the Trans Mountain project very much informs some of my thinking here, because of course this is relatively recent, so it is about pretty recent law. At a legal level, the federal government position would keep winning, although often advocated by the company rather than by the federal government. But the federal government had an element of reluctance to engage in full unilateralism, and there are a variety of reasons for that. The federal government wants to cooperate with provinces on other things, and one doesn't always facilitate that by engaging in a heavy-handed unilateralism on some other thing. There was probably some legal uncertainty being generated at the time, and some of the court rulings that came out later became very clear, and reasserted the federal authority that would be there. But I don't know if it would be different, even with that clear federal authority, in terms of the federal government's willingness to deploy that. And there are a lot of other concepts that come into play that even go beyond legal concepts. Had the federal government acted unilaterally while provinces were resistant, for example, or a province was resistant, it would feed into the public debate in ways that would be different than if the federal and provincial governments and Indigenous governments and everyone had come together cooperatively. And when we talk about developing concepts around social license and the impact of public participation on things, I think there comes to be a federal reluctance to use the full extent of its powers, even though I think there may be times where it should. And a different federal government might make some different choices around that. But thinking of different federal governments over time in the context of a project, it's also necessary to find a route that's going to work for people that think differently on things. And when we talk about sort of these time lengths during which the law might change, during a period of time the politics might change, or the political party in power might change, and it may be important to have a strategy that works for people of different viewpoints around issues, that everyone can come together around. And federal unilateralism sometimes is appealing to some and not to others, and sometimes it switches to whom it appeals, depending on the issue. But more cooperative routes often can be more acceptable to more parties.
Well, let me go to a question from one of the members of the audience. One of our participants asks that your paper addresses the challenges of a government taking leadership in creating the Northern Corridor. Critical to this would be extensive collaboration, obviously, but you also illustrate this could be legally challenged in the future, right? So in your opinion, could a private sector or non-government entity be the nexus of creating the corridor and bring all the governments to the table as a result of participating with other stakeholders and shareholders? You know, would that be a way to reduce some of the battles, constitutional battles and political battles, if we relied more on the leadership of, you know, a private sector partner?
Okay, this is a creative idea and really interesting. I don't know that it solves the constitutional issues in one fell swoop, because a private entity trying to lead things still faces all of the same jurisdictional powers of the different governments, and it doesn't have constitutional authority of its own that could back up the ability to do something. Now, if governments were in agreement that a private sector or non-governmental entity were positioned in a way that it was working well to bring governments together, well, certainly, yeah, they could, in a sense, delegate out that leadership role to the private sector entity through agreement between the governments, or even through the federal government choosing to delegate out that way. At a practical level of who can pull people together, and maybe that is someone outside government, but with the backing of government at the level of the legal powers. The legal powers and jurisdiction wouldn't end up changing in any way that suddenly simplified things, but if that kind of leadership could be exercised successfully by someone out of government, and governments want to work with them, that could be a good creative approach too.
Yeah. Well, other authors on the Canadian Northern Corridor Research Initiative have proposed joint decision-making structures in order to govern the CNC development, right? So you point out, I think in your paper, that negotiated agreements among constitutional players, about the federal government, provinces, territories, Indigenous groups are possible, but governments can't fetter the sovereignty of their government, nor can they delegate their primary areas of authority. You pointed to in 1949, the Trans-Canada Highway was just this kind of an agreement where governments came together around a common purpose. And I guess my question to you is, when I read your paper, that seemed to be the last successful federal, provincial, territorial agreement of this nature. So is it even possible in the modern context to have these kinds of agreements negotiated?
Well, it would certainly be a sad thing if it's not possible. So we have to be more optimistic than that. The obstacle to negotiating the agreements isn't a legal one so much as one concerned with government will and getting the right agreements in place. That said, there are additional challenges for something like the Northern Corridor, possibly even more so than for something like the Trans-Canada Highway. And I say that insofar as this case law on not fettering discretion and not delegating away primary areas of jurisdiction does raise a question around what does a governance mechanism for the Northern Corridor look like? And if that governance structure is meant to be taking up authority that otherwise would be in the hands of governments, there could be some interesting legal issues there in terms of whether that governance structure is subject to challenge or can bind the governments that actually need to be bound by it in some respects if it's to be meaningful. And so there needs to be creativity around the legal mechanisms for establishing that governance structure if it's to take that sort of form, that there's a separate governance structure for this Northern Corridor project. And that's an area that at a high level I'm flagging and saying there's some work to be done there in terms of what's the exact legal structure for that governance mechanism.
One of our audience members asks about whether you could speak to how this might be applicable to some of the challenges of developing corridors in the Arctic, right, in the Arctic waters, where we would then not only be dealing with Canadian constitutional authority, but you have interjurisdictional or international bodies trying to exert their authority. What would some of the challenges be there?
Well, yeah, so I mean, some of the challenges you could see a bit similarly in terms of something like the jurisdictional anti-commons at some theoretical level. Some of the constitutional aspects, strangely, might become simpler, although they're developments that mean maybe they're about the same. And I say that in the sense that in pure constitutional terms, the federal government would be the federal/provincial government at issue. You don't have provincial governments in the Northern Territories, but there has been an ongoing process of territorial devolution that actually sets up the territorial governments with powers relatively akin to those of provinces in some respects. But in constitutional terms, the federal government has quite a bit of sway there. The other dimension, though, is that you have very significant modern treaty relationships in the Arctic regions. A modern treaty is what created the territory of Nunavut and sets up a very different public government structure there that ultimately is meant to be developed around Inuit legal values and traditions. the other territories, there's also a really significant overlay of modern treaties with self-government arrangements there, but there are two sides of that. I mean, it means there are other decision makers with very significant areas of authority, and advantages. They're pretty clear areas of authority because they've been negotiated in these detailed modern agreements, modern treaties. The other dimension to this, though, is that international side. It's the same as any time that Canada is having to engage with international partners, and that can give rise to challenges. We've certainly seen challenging relationships at times with the United States, even within a broadly friendly relationship. And the United States has a very different position in relation to some aspects of our Arctic waters than we do, in terms of favoring freedom of navigation along routes that we consider internal waters. So there's a layer of international law that comes into play. And speaking today in an Arctic context, there's a complication, of course, that part of the Arctic, or a large part of the Arctic, is now in the hands of a government that we're in some meaningful tension with as well. So there are some pretty interesting challenges in terms of talking about Arctic developments. I don't know that I directly analogize them, but there are some analogies to those within Canada. In terms of the whole idea of a jurisdictional anti-commons, but we need to add a lot beyond constitutional law when we start talking about issues there.
Well, this whole discussion just emphasizes the point I think that you make in your paper, is that the route chosen is really important, because as the location is going to trigger authority found in historic treaties as well as the modern treaties. These reside outside the Constitution. So what would be the implications of that for the CNC development? And by this, I mean, this is different from the duty to consult, right? The exposure to some of the requirements of the modern treaties. So does this mean that we need to be ensuring that proponents of the CNC need to ensure a deeper kind of engagement or partnership or involvement, a seat at the table for parts of the project that are envisioned to take place that would engage treaty process?
Oh, indeed. I mean, I think that there needs to be some pretty early engagement with Indigenous communities around even the idea of this. Indigenous communities would need to have a place within the governance mechanism for the project ultimately, but whether they see that as adequate as compared to a current nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government or the Crown is something there might need to be some meaningful discussions around. There need to be meaningful discussions around what are the benefits for Indigenous communities, and those could be real. I mean, Indigenous communities in the vicinity of the Northern Corridor, there may be real economic opportunities that come from that matter to them as well. But the route will be affected by Indigenous rights issues. And the route might also need to take account of those different kinds of legal regimes along the route. I'll just add, if we want to make this a bit more complex too, that the nature of those legal regimes could also change, in the sense that areas that are unceded right now or not subject to a treaty arrangement, there could be ongoing efforts to develop modern treaty arrangements in those regions, and the choice of a route might also usefully depend upon where it's foreseen that there are going to be treaties in place, for example, if that's of assistance to the project. Those kinds of considerations raise a lot of different strategic possibilities for issues like route selection or route discussion. I mean, it's a bit early to talk of route selection, but route discussion depends or involves a lot of different strategic elements there.
Yeah, you bet. Well, one of the areas I wanted to be sure we had time to talk about is the duty to consult. You know, Indigenous rights are recognized and confirmed under Section 35 of the Constitution, and then the duty to consult is clear. Yet governments have really struggled to meet the tests set by the courts, you know, to consult in a meaningful way. And we saw that most recently in some of the recent Supreme Court decisions around the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So some would argue that the courts need to provide more clarity, you know, what exactly would meet the test. But others suggest that governments need to just be more sincere and effective in their efforts to consult. So what's your view of this conundrum that governments find themselves in with respect to the duty to consult?
Well, in simple terms, my answer would be yes. So yes to both. I think
Okay.
there are areas where the courts could meaningfully advance clarity. Others can attempt to do that as well, in terms of scholars continuing to write in the area, governments and Indigenous communities working together around policy frameworks in the area. But at the end of the day, the courts could provide some more clarity on some issues, and that would be very valuable. In part, that will happen naturally over time as some situations end up in the courts. The duty to consult is triggered in Canada hundreds of thousands of times a year, or at least 200,000 times on some good estimates. Most of those don't end up in the courts. Now, that's not to say everyone's happy about every aspect of those. When I say most, I mean the overwhelming proportion of those don't end up in the courts. The number of litigated cases is maybe 100. I don't know. I've not counted that, so don't quote me on that one. But it's really small compared to the number of times it's triggered. That's not to say everyone's happy about every aspect of those situations that aren't litigated, but I guess I'd say there may be more instances in which it's being done successfully than is first apparent. And the case law is accumulating gradually in ways that continue to add clarity, but there are additional questions that would be helpful to get clarification on from the courts. But the other yes is governments also need to try to respond to these general forms of guidance. And so maybe they weren't very good at times at engage in meaningful consultation, and then going and doing that. There's been more clarity added on that in subsequent decisions, both on the pipelines cases themselves, but also in Supreme Court of Canada decisions from around the same time. They in some ways set out a bit of a roadmap on elements to meaningful consultation. If one looks at cases like Clyde River and Chippewas of the Thames, the Supreme Court of Canada provided quite a bit of guidance there. One of the drawbacks to the guidance they're giving is that it adds more and more formality to the process, and that's not always what everyone wants. But if governments need a formal roadmap, a checklist, things like showing that they've actually listened to issues raised and writing down how they've responded to those might be a necessary step. And I think that's what we've seen as some guidance from the pipelines cases. In an ideal world, maybe we wouldn't need to write everything down in those formal ways, but governments with that kind of guidance, it probably will help to direct them to take up more meaningful forms of consultation so they can write those down in a way that will establish a record that supports a project.
Agreed. I'm just reviewing some of the questions in the chat box, and of course, one of them I think you just answered directly about, you know, what does meaningful consultation look like. Another question is that transportation, you know, what we're talking about here through the Canadian Northern Corridor is a transportation route. And of course, traditionally transportation routes, in order to be as efficient as possible and kind of optimize efficiency overall, they need to be kind of as straight as possible. You know, it's not just always engineers taking a ruler and drawing a line on a map, but to be honest, it's not that far off that. So route selection really requires this efficiency. So that route selection can't always be driven primarily by more political considerations or considerations about involvement of various groups or engagement of treaties or other constructs. So, what is your thought around this tension, right, between efficiency and kind of accommodation or engagement? And I think, an example we could look at would be, the Keystone Pipeline, right? The Keystone Pipeline through the US, developed and designed to be very efficient, but they ran into, significant opposition from environmental groups, community groups, citizen groups, because of a variety of other concerns that needed to be accommodated. So what's your thought about that tension?
So those challenging particular routes haven't always framed those challenges in economic terms, but they could, because they could say that part of the efficiency consideration needs to be the costs that are imposed by a particular route, either in environmental terms and or in social terms. And then the challenge becomes how you measure those. And that's probably why they've not put those in economic terms. But those do matter. If one's putting value on them, they have to come into the calculation somehow. But probably not as absolute constraints in very many instances, but as an element that comes in a real way. One of the challenges, of course, that people self-describe the value they put on environmental aspects very differently than what economists will measure in terms of their actual willingness to pay for environmental considerations. And there are big challenges here in terms of how do we work our way through those different numbers. But you could, in principle, bring some of these things into the numbers as actually part of the economic costs of a particular route. That would be one thing I'd say on this. I don't think that's a magic answer, but it's one that tries to hide the tension and say you could bring everything together. On the other side of it, I don't think there's an easy way to just avoid this tension, and we have to work through various things that are valuable and try to take them all into account.
Absolutely. Well, I think, unfortunately, I think that's all the time that we have for today. I do want to thank you so much, Dwight, for your work on this paper and for the discussion here today. It's just been excellent. And I would like to thank the audience for joining us as well. Professor Newman's paper is going to be published by the School of Public Policy in the coming weeks. So please visit us at thepolicyschool.ca or watch our social media to ensure that you know when this paper is available to pick it up and read it, because it is absolutely worth the read. Our final webinar in the series is on Wednesday, March 16th on reducing transaction costs on infrastructure corridor projects in Canada. You can register for this webinar at policyschool.ca. The recording of today's presentation will also be available within 2 business days, so you can watch it or share it with your colleagues or anyone who might be interested, because again, I think we've had just a really strong and interesting discussion today. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope all of you have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.